When fake HOA enforcers tried to intimidate a veteran on his own ranch, they expected fear and compliance. Instead, they walked straight into a masterclass in military protocol and left in handcuffs. The sound of tires crunching on gravel cut through the stillness of a Texas evening. Roland Jeffries looked up from the porch where he was oiling a set of garden shears. At first, he thought it was a neighbor dropping by unannounced, but the headlights slicing across his ranch driveway weren't familiar, and the vehicle that appeared was a dark SUV with tinted windows. Two men stepped out, dressed in tactical vests that glistened under the security lights. Their boots hit the ground with a heavy thud, and almost instantly, Roland's instincts sharpened. Something didn't sit right. The taller man adjusted his vest and flashed what looked like a badge. "Mr. Jeffries?" he called out. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. We've been instructed to secure any firearms on the property for safety review." Roland didn't move at first. He just studied them. The shorter one clutched a folder tucked under his arm, pretending it was some kind of official paperwork. Roland's eyes flicked from the phony badge to the SUV, to the boots, to the way the man held himself. Every detail spoke louder than the words coming out of their mouths. "HOA, huh?" Roland finally said, his voice low but steady. "Strange. I didn't think this land fell under an association." The shorter one smirked. "Regulations have changed. We'll need to collect your weapons tonight. We've got the warrant right here." He tapped the folder like it was a magic key. Roland set the garden shears down on the step beside him. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't about to be. At 44, after 2 tours in Afghanistan as a logistics sergeant, he'd seen men bluff and posture under far worse conditions. But this? 2 strangers in gear that looked like it was ordered off the internet? This was sloppy. Still, his pulse ticked faster. Not from fear, but from calculation. He leaned back against the porch post, arms folded. "If you've got a warrant, let me take a look." The taller man walked forward, stopping just short of the porch. He pulled out a single sheet of paper that looked like it had been run through a home printer. Roland scanned the page quickly. The font was off, the signature was pixelated, and the seal was nothing more than a blurry logo. Roland's jaw shifted slightly. He'd seen counterfeit paperwork before, back when smugglers overseas tried to disguise themselves as aid workers. This was the same kind of sloppiness. "You boys new at this?" Roland asked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. The shorter one stiffened. "Just hand over the guns, Mr. Jeffries. No need to make this harder than it has to be." Roland let the silence stretch. The crickets in the distance seemed louder now, filling the gaps between words. He finally stood, not quickly, not in a way that would spook them, but steady, deliberate. He was taller than both of them, broad-shouldered, and the kind of man who carried authority without having to announce it. "You come to my ranch after dark, with fake badges and fake paperwork," Roland said slowly. "You're lucky I don't treat you like intruders." The taller man shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the SUV. The shorter one held his ground, but Roland could see the tension in his shoulders. That's when Roland made a choice. He didn't yell, he didn't storm forward. Instead, he reached for the remote, clipped to his belt, and pressed a button. Instantly, the floodlights mounted on his property lit up the entire front yard like it was noon. Every shadow was erased. The 2 imposters squinted, raising their hands to block the glare. "Let me be clear," Roland said, his voice cutting through the brightness. "I don't take kindly to strangers on my property, and I don't scare easy." The taller man muttered something under his breath. The shorter one tried to recover, holding the fake warrant higher as if the paper would suddenly turn real under the light. But Roland wasn't fooled. Inside, his military training was already clicking into place. Assess the threat, control the ground, gather evidence, communicate clearly. He knew what needed to be done, and he wasn't about to let these 2 clowns dictate the terms. He stepped back toward the door and angled his body so the small security camera above the frame had a clear view of the men. Then he raised his voice just enough. "You're on camera. Everything you're saying and doing is recorded. So if you're thinking of making this a bad night, think twice." The taller one exhaled sharply. The shorter one lowered the folder just a fraction. Neither of them had expected this kind of pushback. Most targets probably folded under pressure. But Roland Jeffries was not most targets. For a moment, the air hung heavy with silence, the kind of pause where anything could happen next. But this was only the beginning, and Roland was already shifting into a mode the imposters couldn't match. Roland Jeffries wasn't the kind of man people forgot after meeting once. At 6'1", with shoulders that still carried the discipline of his army years, he had a presence that filled a room without a single word spoken. But behind the stern exterior lived a man who craved the ordinary. Quiet evenings, the sound of cicadas in summer, the freedom to work the soil and call the land his own. He hadn't always lived in Palo Mesa. For most of his adult life, he had been on the move. Deployment after deployment, first to Kandahar, then to Helmand Province, and later to smaller forward operating bases scattered across Afghanistan. He was a logistics sergeant, the kind of soldier who knew how to keep supply chains moving under fire, how to ration resources when convoys were cut off, and how to improvise when a plan went sideways. Jeffries, his old commanding officer once told him, "You don't panic, you adapt." Those words stuck with him long after he traded camouflage for denim. When he retired from the military, Roland tried city life for a while. He rented an apartment in Phoenix, worked a short contract job with a freight company, and thought maybe he'd grow used to traffic and crowded grocery stores. But the city didn't sit right with him. Too noisy, too many faces, too much surveillance that wasn't his own. After years of danger abroad, Roland wanted peace. Not the kind you snatch between assignments, but the kind that settles deep into your bones. That's when he came across the ranch in Palo Mesa. Nearly 10 acres, a modest single-story house, a detached barn, and a gravel driveway that wound like a ribbon off the county road. The price was fair, the land was solid, and most importantly, it was his. No chain of command, no landlords, just open space and the right to breathe. Neighbors respected him, even if they didn't know much about his past. He wasn't the loudest man at community gatherings, but when he spoke, people listened. The closest neighbor, Janine Colburn, a retired nurse who had spent her career in San Antonio before settling in Palo Mesa, often checked in on him. "You finally look at peace here, Roland," she said one afternoon while bringing over a jar of homemade peach preserves. "I try," he replied with a smile. "But peace doesn't just happen. You've got to be ready to protect it." Janine didn't press further, but she understood enough. Many evenings she'd see him walking the property line, not paranoid, just watchful. Old habits die hard. Still, Roland found joy in small things. He kept a vegetable garden near the back of the property, raised a pair of cattle, and spent long hours in his workshop restoring old farm equipment. He read military history, but also surprised neighbors by recommending books on philosophy. He believed in preparation, but he also believed in understanding people, why they act the way they do, what makes them choose fear or courage. But beneath the routine, Roland always had a mental switch. A part of him that never fully left Afghanistan. A part that could wake up in an instant if something felt wrong. He never bragged about it, never waved it like a flag, but it was there, quiet, waiting. The truth was, Roland didn't expect his training to be tested back home. Palo Mesa was calm. Crime was low. Folks left doors unlocked during the day. That's why the SUV pulling into his driveway 3 weeks ago felt like a ripple in still water. Nothing in his years on the ranch had prepared him for imposters disguised as officials. He replayed the moment often in his head afterward, the fake badge, the mismatched gear, the arrogance in their tone. And he remembered how quickly that switch inside him flipped. One second he was oiling shears, the next he was cataloguing every detail the way he once scanned hostile checkpoints overseas. Janine later told him, "Most people would have been scared stiff, Roland. They'd have opened the door, maybe even handed things over just to avoid conflict. But you—" She paused, shaking her head. "You didn't even blink." Roland didn't correct her, though he knew it wasn't bravery. It was muscle memory. All those years of drills, of rehearsing the worst-case scenario, had carved permanent grooves into his thinking. And while he never sought recognition, That training had saved him before, and now it might have saved him again. But the imposters weren't finished yet, and Roland knew the real confrontation was only beginning. The taller man took another step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel, as if he wanted to grind Roland's patience down with it. Roland didn't move from the porch. His eyes stayed fixed, sharp, and steady, like a soldier assessing a terrain map for danger zones. The shorter man, the one holding the paperwork, cleared his throat. "Look, Mr. Jeffries, we don't want this to turn into a problem. The association sent us out here to make sure things stay safe for everyone. We're not here to argue." Roland tilted his head just slightly. "Safe for who?" "My land isn't under your HOA. Never has been," the taller man quickly jumped in. "Regulations expanded last month." "You probably missed the notice. It's standard procedure." "We're going door to door." That was the first real tell. Roland's eyes flicked down to the badge again. A real officer, even one representing a city code office, wouldn't have used a vague phrase like standard procedure. They'd cite a statute, reference a case number, or at least know the name of the ordinance. These men were improvising. "You say you're door to door," Roland said slowly. "Funny. My nearest neighbor's half a mile away. You stop there first?" The shorter man hesitated. The taller one's jaw flexed. Neither answered. Roland gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then asked, "What's the name of the sheriff here?" "The sheriff?" The shorter man glanced nervously at his partner. "We don't answer to him. We answer to the association." Roland chuckled under his breath. "Thought so." The taller man bristled. "Are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have to escalate this?" Now there was an edge in the man's tone, the kind of sharpness that usually preceded violence. Roland caught it, weighed it, and filed it away. His mind ticked through options. Retreat wasn't one of them. "Escalate?" Roland repeated, his voice calm but firm. "This is my ranch. You're the ones trespassing. You've got about 2 minutes to tell me who you really are before I treat this like a break-in." The shorter man stepped forward and raised the fake warrant higher. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "We've got authority here." Roland didn't bother to look at the paper again. "Authority comes with real credentials. Yours don't hold up." The taller man shifted, and Roland noticed the bulge under his vest. A holstered weapon. Not carried with the ease of a trained officer, but clumsy, insecure, like someone who thought wearing a gun made them powerful. Roland made a mental note. He didn't announce it. He just let the knowledge sit there, waiting. "Let me ask you something," Roland said, lowering his voice so they had to lean in to catch it. "If this is official, why aren't there squad cars? Why no marked vehicles? Why are you driving around in a black SUV with no plates on the front?" The shorter man's face twitched. The taller one cursed under his breath. Roland stepped back slowly toward his door, his hand brushing against the side of the frame. The small movement triggered the interior lock mechanism he'd wired himself, a precaution he'd built into the ranch long before this night. Behind him, he heard the click of steel sliding into place. "You boys want to keep playing dress-up. Go right ahead," Roland said. "But understand something. I don't play games on my own land." The taller man took a step closer. "You're making a mistake. We can call in backup." Roland's eyes hardened. "Then do it. Call them. I'll wait." Neither reached for a radio. Neither had one. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the buzz of insects under the floodlights and the steady rhythm of Roland's breath. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just waited, letting silence do what it always does. Expose the truth. The shorter man finally tried again, his voice breaking just slightly. "Look, we don't want this to go sideways. Just cooperate. Hand over what we need, and we'll be out of your hair." Roland smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Out of my hair, huh? That's the first honest thing you've said tonight." He reached slowly into his back pocket, not for a weapon, but for his phone. With deliberate calm, he raised it and aimed the lens directly at them. The recording light blinked red. "You're live now," Roland said. "Keep talking." The taller man's shoulders tensed, and for the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected cameras. And they sure hadn't expected Roland Jeffries. But Roland knew this wasn't over. The real test was still coming, and it would demand every ounce of control he had. Roland had seen enough in those first few minutes to know these men weren't who they claimed to be. Every word they spoke, every twitch of the hand, every sidestep, they were leaking their fraud all over the gravel driveway. But suspicion wasn't enough. He needed certainty, something undeniable, something that would stand up not just to his instincts, but to the law if it came to that. He kept his phone aimed at them, recording steadily. "Go ahead," he said calmly. "Tell me again what association you're with." The shorter man puffed up his chest like a bird trying to appear larger. "Palo Mesa Homeowners Association, this is official business." Roland narrowed his eyes. "Palo Mesa doesn't have a homeowners association." His tone was sharp, clipped, like the crack of a branch underfoot. The taller man flinched. Just slightly, but Roland caught it. His years overseas had trained him to pick up on micro-movements. A nervous blink, a shift of weight, a tightening of fingers. All tells of someone caught in a lie. "You sure about that?" the shorter man snapped back, trying to recover. "Regulations are always changing." You wouldn't know unless you read the letters. Roland lowered the phone for a second, just enough to make his next words sink in. "Funny thing, I read every piece of mail that comes across my box. And not once did I see anything about an HOA. You want to explain that?" Silence. Just the whine of insects outside, the glow of the floodlights, and the quiet tick of Roland's pulse. The taller man shifted again, his hand brushing near his vest as if to remind Roland he was armed. But Roland noticed something else this time. The weapon holster wasn't standard issue. It was cheap, the kind you bought online, not the kind supplied to law enforcement. The stitching was uneven, the material already fraying at the edges. He let his eyes drop down to the boots next. Different brands, different wear patterns. Real teams didn't show up mismatched like this. One pair had deep mud caked in the treads, the other looked almost new. No uniformity, no discipline, just two men who'd thrown gear together hoping it would intimidate. And then there was the warrant. Roland motioned with his chin toward the folder. "Let me see that again." The shorter man hesitated, then reluctantly held it out. Roland took the paper without flinching, holding it under the light. The words bled across the page with uneven spacing, like a bad cut-and-paste job. The header read, County Enforcement Division, but the seal beneath it wasn't even for the county. It was a blurry state emblem stretched out of proportion. Roland raised an eyebrow. "Who signed this?" Officer McIntyre," the shorter man blurted. Roland's mouth tugged into a tight smile. "There's no Officer McIntyre in Palo Mesa. Sheriff's Department doesn't even use that title." The taller man growled, "Stop playing smart, Jeffries. Just hand it over." Roland folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his back pocket. "No. This is evidence now." The shorter man's face went red. "That's not yours to keep." Roland's voice was steady, calm, but with an edge that could cut steel. "It sure is. Because if I turn this over to the sheriff, they'll want to know who thought it was a good idea to fake government documents. That's a felony." The taller man took a step forward, his hand flexing near his vest again. Roland noticed the movement but didn't react outwardly. Inside, his instincts screamed preparation. He had seen this posture before, in alleys overseas, in roadblocks that could turn violent with the wrong glance. The imposter was weighing whether to try force. "Think carefully," Roland said, his voice quieter now, forcing them to lean closer. "Because every second you're here, you're on camera. Every word you say is being logged. And if you make one wrong move, deputies will be here faster than you think." The taller man froze. His partner shifted on his heels, suddenly less sure of himself. The false bravado that had carried them up the driveway was starting to crack. Roland used the silence to press harder. "What's really going on? Who sent you? Because I know damn well it wasn't any homeowners association." Neither answered. The taller man's jaw worked like he wanted to spit out a threat, but couldn't form the words. The shorter one clutched the strap of his vest, fingers twitching nervously. In that moment, Roland's suspicion hardened into certainty. These weren't officers. They weren't even professional criminals. They were opportunists, amateurs who thought intimidation and props could carry them through. Roland kept his stance calm, unshaken, but inside he was already flipping through the next steps. Secure the ground, control the narrative, prepare for escalation. But the imposters weren't leaving, and Roland knew his training was about to be tested in real time. Roland had made his judgment. These men weren't who they said they were. And once certainty set in, the part of him that had been quiet since his last deployment stirred awake. His body shifted into that mode he thought he'd left in Afghanistan, a controlled, practiced state where every detail mattered and every move was deliberate. He took a half-step backward toward his door, his thumb pressing another button on the small remote clipped to his belt. A faint click echoed across the yard. To the imposters, it might have sounded like nothing. To Roland, it meant his second layer of security had locked into place. Steel bars slid silently behind the windows, shutters sealed across the back entry, and the gate at the far end of his driveway dropped into lockdown mode. The taller man squinted. "What was that?" Roland shrugged. "That was me taking control of my property." The shorter one scoffed. "You think toys are going to stop us?" Roland's lips curved into a faint smile. "They aren't toys. They're measures. Learned a long time ago. When you're outnumbered or outgunned, the ground you control is your best weapon." The taller man frowned, clearly not used to someone talking like that. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Roland corrected him. "You made it hard the moment you drove up here pretending to be something you're not." He angled his body slightly, ensuring the camera mounted above the porch had a clean shot of their faces. Then he raised his phone again, the red light blinking steadily. "You know," Roland said, his tone conversational but sharp as a blade. "I used to run convoys down Highway 1 in Afghanistan. Every checkpoint looked different. Some legit, some traps. And you too?" He motioned toward them with his phone. "You're the trap, but you don't even play it well." The shorter man barked. "Shut up!" Roland didn't flinch. He leaned against the porch railing as if he had all the time in the world. "See? Real authority doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't hide behind fake paper and cheap gear. Real authority stands steady. You two, you're shaking." The taller man stiffened, his shoulders rising with frustration. His partner glanced nervously at the SUV, like he wanted to bolt but couldn't decide. Roland let silence stretch again, the way he used to when interrogating smugglers caught with falsified manifests. He knew silence was powerful. It forced the other side to fill the void, often with mistakes. Finally, the shorter man tried again, his voice cracking. We don't have time for this. Just hand over the guns." Jeffries Roland's voice was low now, almost casual. "Funny thing about time. I've got plenty. You don't." And with that, he pressed another button on his remote. The floodlights shifted, cutting harsh beams directly into their faces. The imposters raised their hands against the glare, stumbling slightly on the gravel. Behind them, another sensor tripped, and Roland's external cameras rotated, focusing in from multiple angles. Their SUV lit up with a spotlight he'd mounted near the barn. The taller man cursed again, this time louder, angrier. "You think you're scaring us?" Roland tilted his head. "Scaring you? Number, I'm documenting you, that's what matters, because when deputies get here, they'll have no doubt about who you are or what you tried." The shorter man looked ready to snap. "Deputies? You think they'll get here in time?" Roland allowed himself the faintest grin. Already called. That was a lie. But it was a strategic one. He hadn't made the call yet. He wanted these men sweating, second-guessing. He wanted them aware that their window was closing fast. The taller one shifted, hand brushing his vest again. Roland caught the gesture, catalogued it, and straightened up. His voice hardened. "You touch that weapon, you'll regret it. Not because of me, but because the second you do, the sheriff's deputies won't give you the benefit of the doubt." Neither moved. Both men seemed caught between bluffing further and retreating. Roland's tone shifted again, steady and even. "You came here thinking intimidation was enough. But intimidation only works if the other man doesn't know better. I know better. And I know this. Your little act ends tonight." The taller man glanced sideways at his partner, muttering something Roland couldn't quite catch. The shorter man whispered back, clearly unsettled. Their coordination was unraveling. Roland pressed one last button, and the faint sound of sirens echoed from speakers hidden near the fence line. A recording he'd set up years ago for deterrence. The imposters froze, glancing around in panic. "You hear that?" Roland asked, his voice calm, almost mocking. "That's the sound of your time running out." The taller one swore under his breath, his confidence cracking. The shorter man looked ready to run, but Roland knew fear could make desperate men dangerous, and the real showdown was about to ignite. The air felt charged, as if the whole ranch was holding its breath. Roland stood tall on his porch, his phone still aimed like a weapon, the blinking red light catching the imposter's eyes every few seconds. He could see it working. What had started as arrogance was unraveling into hesitation. But hesitation, Roland knew, could turn lethal in a heartbeat. The taller man shifted first. He pulled at his vest strap, fingers tapping nervously against the grip of the holstered pistol. The movement was deliberate enough to remind Roland the weapon was there, yet clumsy enough to betray uncertainty. "You've made this worse for yourself," the taller man growled. "We tried to do this clean." Roland's answer came steady, almost calm. "Clean is knocking during the day, with proper identification, in a marked vehicle. Clean isn't sneaking up in the dark with fake papers and second-hand gear. You call this clean?" The shorter one shot a glare at his partner. "Forget the speech, just do it already," he hissed. Roland caught the exchange. His instincts flared. This was the dangerous moment. One was losing his nerve, the other was teetering on aggression. Together, they were unstable. He adjusted his stance, subtly bracing one foot against the step, the other angled toward the door. His hand hovered near the porch railing, where just inside reach he'd set a heavy steel flashlight. Not a weapon, not yet, but close enough if he needed it. "Think real hard before you move," Roland warned, "because I've spent my life reading men like you. And I can tell you, your bluff's almost out." The taller man snapped. "You don't know who we answer to." Roland locked eyes with him, unblinking. "Then say it. Who sent you?" Silence. The taller man opened his mouth, then shut it again. His partner shifted his weight from one foot to the other, eyes darting toward the SUV as if calculating the sprint it would take to get back inside. Roland pressed the advantage. "I'll tell you who's coming next. The sheriff. Every second you stand here, you make it worse. Trespassing, fraud, impersonating officials, carrying firearms while doing it. You really want to explain that in front of a judge?" The shorter man snapped, his voice cracking. "Stop talking to us like we're children!" Roland's reply was ice cold. "Then stop acting like it!" The words landed hard. The taller man's face flushed red with anger. He yanked at the Velcro of his vest, adjusting it in frustration. Roland could see the strain in his jaw, the fight building behind his eyes. The tension hit a breaking point. The taller man stepped forward, closing the gap between the gravel and the porch. Roland raised his phone higher, making sure the camera caught every movement. "You're 1 second from making the worst mistake of your life," Roland said, his voice low, measured. "And when that second's gone, you don't get it back." For a long, dangerous moment, the taller man just stared, chest rising and falling like a bull about to charge. But then, something cracked. His eyes flicked sideways, just briefly, toward the flashing light on Roland's phone. That tiny reminder of evidence, of accountability, pulled him back from the edge. "Man, this is stupid," the shorter one muttered, tugging at his partner's arm. "We should go." Now Roland didn't let up. "You should have thought of that before you trespassed. Now you're on tape, your faces are documented, your vehicle's lit up like a Christmas tree. You're not just leaving this behind." The taller man cursed under his breath. "We're not done here, Jeffries." Roland's voice cut through him like steel. "Oh, you're done. Whether you walk away in cuffs or just drive off, that part's still up to you. But this act? Finished." The two imposters stood frozen, caught between bluster and retreat. Roland could see the calculation written across their faces. For the first time since stepping out of the SUV, they realized they weren't in control. And that shift, when intimidation gave way to fear, was exactly what Roland had been working toward. But fear was unpredictable, and as the taller man clenched his fists and glanced again at his weapon, Roland knew the danger wasn't over. In fact, it was about to peak. But before fists or weapons could decide the outcome, flashing lights began to paint the far end of the road. Help was on its way, and the standoff was seconds from breaking wide open. The first faint sweep of red and blue lights cut through the night sky, bouncing off the trees lining Roland's long driveway. The sound followed seconds later, low at first, then rising steadily as the sheriff's cruisers closed in. Roland didn't move from his porch. He stood steady, recording, watching as the imposters finally turned their heads toward the flashing lights. Their entire posture shifted. The taller one stiffened like he'd been caught mid-crime, because he had. The shorter one's composure cracked entirely, his jaw working, his hand twitching near his side like he was fighting the urge to run. "You called them?" The shorter man snapped, voice higher now, brittle with panic. Roland's tone was calm, deliberate. "Told you. Deputies move faster than you think." The taller one spat into the gravel. "We can explain this. We'll tell them we had authority." Roland raised an eyebrow. "With what? That fake warrant? Those dollar store vests? You really think a trained deputy won't smell your act in 5 seconds?" The SUV doors slammed open at the end of the drive. 2 cruisers had boxed it in, headlights blazing, tires crunching hard as deputies stepped out. Their flashlights cut through the night like spears. Voices rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hands where we can see them!" One deputy shouted. The imposters froze. For a beat, no one moved. Then the shorter man slowly lifted his hands, palms trembling in the glare. The taller one hesitated longer, his pride anchoring him in place. Roland could see the stubbornness burning in his eyes. The deputy repeated, louder, "Hands up! Now!" Finally, the taller man raised them, his face twisted in anger. "This is a mistake!" he shouted back. "We're here on official—" "Quiet!" the deputy barked. "Don't say another word!" Roland kept his camera steady, making sure the deputies could see him too. "I'm the property owner," he called out. "They're not who they say they are. Check their paperwork. Check their gear. It's all fake." A deputy broke off from the formation and approached the porch, flashlight sweeping briefly across Roland before lowering in recognition. "Mr. Jeffries?" "That's right," Roland replied. "Everything's recorded." They came in a black SUV, no plates in the front. Claimed to be HOA, tried to take my firearms. The deputy gave a curt nod, then turned back to his colleagues. "Secure the suspects." Within moments, deputies closed in. The imposters were ordered face down on the gravel. The taller one gritted his teeth, muttering curses as cuffs snapped around his wrists. The shorter one's entire body trembled, his words spilling out in incoherent protests. "We didn't mean... We were just... This is a misunderstanding." Roland's jaw set firm as he listened. Misunderstanding? Number. This had been calculated, even if poorly executed. One deputy retrieved the fake warrant from Roland's pocket, holding it up under a flashlight. His eyebrows shot up. "This isn't even close to real." He shook his head in disbelief. "You really thought this would pass?" The taller man barked back. "We had orders." "From who?" The deputy shot back. The man clamped his mouth shut. The deputies exchanged looks, already sensing there was more to dig into. They pulled the imposters up, cuffed and subdued, and guided them toward the cruisers. Their SUV was left behind, its doors still open, its interior lit up under the barn spotlight Roland had triggered. One deputy lingered with Roland on the porch. "You kept your cool," he said, almost with admiration. "Most folks would have panicked, maybe even tried to fight. Could have gone real bad." Roland shook his head. "Panic never helps. I just used what I know." The deputy studied him for a moment. "You military?" "Army," Roland confirmed. "Logistics sergeant. Spent enough time overseas to recognize a bluff when I see one." The deputy gave a low whistle. "Well, good thing you did. These guys. They've been trying similar stunts in the next county over. HOA scams, utility scams, anything to get people to open their doors or hand over valuables. You're the first one to turn the tables." Roland folded his arms, looking toward the cruisers where the imposters sat, heads lowered, caught at last. "They picked the wrong driveway tonight." The deputy offered a tight smile. "That they did? But you might have just helped us connect some dots. There's been a string of reports, People intimidated, sometimes robbed, sometimes worse. With this evidence, we'll finally have a trail. Roland gave a slow nod. Glad I could help. But let's be clear, it could have gone the other way. People need to know how dangerous this is. The deputy agreed, scribbling notes in his pad. We'll make sure they do. As the cruisers pulled away, carrying the impostors into custody, the floodlights on Roland's property still blazed, illuminating every corner of his land. He didn't turn them off yet, not until the last car disappeared down the road. He stood there, quiet now, letting his pulse slow back to normal. But as the night settled again, Roland knew this wasn't just about two impostors. It was about something deeper, something that would ripple through his neighbors and his entire county. By sunrise the next morning, word of what had happened on Roland's ranch was already spreading through Palo Mesa like a wildfire. News traveled fast in small communities, especially when it involved danger just down the road. People who usually waved in passing at the feed store or nodded politely at church were now stopping one another with urgency, retelling the story in their own words, each version carrying a sharper edge of fear. Roland didn't care for gossip, but he knew people would come to him sooner or later. Sure enough, by mid-morning, his nearest neighbor, Janine Colburn, appeared at the edge of his driveway. She held a thermos of coffee in one hand and her dog's leash in the other. The dog tugged forward, eager, but Janine's face was pinched with worry. I heard about last night, she said, her voice breaking slightly as she drew closer. Are you all right? Roland offered a nod, steady and calm. I'm fine. Sheriff's deputies handled the rest. She shook her head. Fine? Roland, you had armed men at your door. That's not fine. He didn't argue, but his silence spoke for him. Janine stepped onto the gravel, her dog circling her legs. I've lived here 20 years, Roland. I've never heard of anything like this happening in Palo Mesa. We don't even lock our gates most of the time. And now... She stopped herself, pressing the thermos into his hand. Now I don't know if I'll ever feel the same way again. Roland took the coffee, its warmth seeping into his calloused palms. You'll feel the same again, he said finally. But it takes preparation, awareness. Too many people think bad things can't happen in quiet places. They can. They just don't happen often. Until they do. Janine's eyes flicked toward the barn, where the SUV still sat under a tarp, waiting to be processed by deputies. What if they had come to my place instead? She asked softly. What if it had been me? Alone? No cameras, no training. Roland didn't sugarcoat his answer. That's why you don't open the door just because someone flashes a badge. Real authority doesn't mind being checked. Real officers don't take it personal when you ask for proof. Janine exhaled shakily. I've trusted too much. Last month a man came by saying he was from the water utility. I let him onto my property without even thinking. What if... Roland cut her off gently. Then today, you start thinking. That's the lesson. Trust, but verify. Always later that afternoon, more neighbors trickled in. Some came in pairs, others alone, each wearing the same tight expressions Janine had carried. They stood in Roland's yard, listening as he explained the night in detail, showing them where the men had stood, how the fake paperwork looked, how the SUV had no plates. One man, Clark Beringer, a rancher with weathered hands and a habit of chewing toothpicks, asked bluntly, You think they'll come back? Roland shook his head. Not these two. They're in custody. But men like them, opportunists, they'll always exist. They just move on when one place gets too hot. Clark spat the toothpick into the dirt. Damn cowards. They'd never try that in broad daylight. Don't be so sure, Roland said. They count on people being polite, being trusting. That's the weakness they prey on. Doesn't matter if it's day or night. The group grew quiet at that, each neighbor turning the thought over. It wasn't easy to accept that the very habits that made their community friendly could also leave them vulnerable. Janine finally broke the silence. So, what do we do now? Roland glanced around at the faces, people he saw at the diner, at the feed store, at Sunday service. Ordinary people who'd just had their sense of safety cracked wide open. You prepare, Roland said simply. You verify, and you stand together. They want us isolated, easy targets. Don't give them that. By evening, deputies had hauled the SUV away for evidence. The ranch was quieter again, though not as quiet as before. For the first time, Roland noticed how his neighbors lingered longer, glancing toward the end of the driveway, as if shadows could hold more imposters waiting to arrive. That night, Janine called him on the landline, her voice steadier but still tinged with fear. "I just wanted to say thank you, Roland." For not letting them win, Roland leaned back in his chair, staring out the window into the dark. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because survival's not about luck. It's about being ready." Janine was silent for a long moment. Then she said softly, "I guess we all have to start being ready now." When he hung up, Roland sat alone with the thought. The peace he had worked so hard to carve out of this land would never feel the same again. But maybe that was the point. Peace was never meant to be passive. It had to be guarded, or it was gone. But Roland also knew the sheriff's words weren't just talk. This wasn't an isolated incident. Something bigger was moving across Texas, and the ranch standoff was just one piece of it. 2 days later, Roland sat across from Sheriff Douglas Hart in a cramped office inside the Palo Mesa substation. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, the walls lined with faded maps of the county, and a bulletin board cluttered with notes. A deputy set a thin case file on the desk and left them alone. Sheriff Hart leaned back in his chair, his expression worn from too many long nights. "I'll give it to you straight, Jeffries," he said. "What happened on your ranch isn't a one-off. We've been tracking similar incidents all over central Texas." Roland folded his arms, listening closely. Hart flipped open the folder. Inside were reports, neighbors intimidated by fake code enforcers, families tricked by men posing as utility workers, even an elderly couple who had handed over cash after 2 strangers claimed to be from the county tax office. "See this one?" Hart tapped a page. "Johnson County, 3 weeks back. 2 men with fake sheriff badges tried to confiscate firearms from a retired school teacher. She panicked and let them inside, lost 3 rifles and a safe full of keepsakes. They never came back." Roland studied the page, jaw tightening. "Same playbook." "Exactly," Hart said. "It's spreading. Different counties, same tactics. They target rural areas, folks who don't expect scams this bold. You're the first one who didn't fold." Roland let that settle for a moment. His eyes drifted to another page, showing a grainy photo of 2 men in vests. Not the same pair from his ranch, but close enough in style. "They working in teams?" Hart nodded. "Always pairs. Sometimes trios. They move fast, hit a handful of homes, then vanish. By the time we piece it together, they're 2 counties over." "Organized?" Roland asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out." Hart sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We've picked up a few low-level guys. None of them give us names. Just say they were told to dress the part. Get in, get out. Whoever's behind it knows how to keep layers between themselves and the front line." Roland leaned forward, voice low. "So the men at my ranch, they're pawns." Hart met his eyes. "Exactly. And pawns are easy to sacrifice." The weight of the sheriff's words settled heavy. Roland thought back to the taller man's stubbornness, the way he nearly drew on him. Pawns desperate to prove themselves were dangerous. They had nothing to lose. "What happens to them now?" Roland asked. "Charges. Impersonating officials, attempted theft, trespassing, the works," Hart replied. "But don't fool yourself. Once they make bail, someone else will be there to scoop them up and send them right back out. These operations don't stop because 2 men are in cuffs." Roland sat back, his mind running through layers of military strategy. You don't just fight pawns. You cut off the supply lines. You make the cost of the operation outweigh the reward. You need community awareness, Roland said finally. Meetings, alerts, training on how to verify credentials. Make it harder for these guys to get through the front door. Hart studied him for a moment. That military in you never quit, did it? Roland gave a faint shrug. Preparation isn't something you retire from. You either stay sharp, or you pay for it later. The sheriff nodded slowly. You might be onto something. If folks saw what you did, how you kept control without pulling a trigger, it could save lives. I'm not interested in the spotlight. Roland said. "But if it helps the neighbors, I'll talk." Later that week, the sheriff's office hosted a town meeting inside the community hall. Rows of folding chairs filled with ranchers, retirees, young families, and shop owners. Roland sat in the front, arms folded, listening as Hart explained the string of imposter cases, warning residents to demand proper identification and never be afraid to call the station to verify. Then Hart turned toward Roland. "Mr. Jeffries here showed exactly how to handle it. Kept his cool, documented everything, didn't give them an inch." The crowd turned their eyes on him, and Roland shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't wanted attention, but now every neighbor leaned forward, waiting. "Look," Roland said, clearing his throat. "I'm no hero. I just treated the situation like it was hostile ground. You don't panic. You don't open the door just because someone's loud. And you never hand over what's yours without proof. Trust people, yes, but verify first. That's the difference between being a victim and walking away safe." Janine, sitting 2 rows back, whispered to the woman next to her. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." The sheriff nodded firmly. "We'll be setting up a hotline, distributing flyers, even going door to door to explain what to watch for. But let me be clear, this isn't over. We believe there's a network behind this, and until we cut the head off the snake, they'll keep trying." The hall filled with murmurs, fear mixing with determination. Roland sat quietly, watching his neighbors take it all in. He could see it on their faces, the realization that the peace they had taken for granted was more fragile than they ever knew. But as Roland left the hall that night, he understood something himself. Peace wasn't gone. It just needed guarding, and the responsibility to guard it now rested on every single person in that room. The night after the town meeting, Roland sat alone on his porch, the same porch where it had all started. The crickets sang their usual song, the stars stretched wide across the Texas sky, and the land around him felt calm again, but not the same kind of calm as before. This calm carried weight. It carried the memory of 2 men in fake vests, the sound of boots on gravel, the gleam of headlights where they didn't belong. He sipped black coffee from a chipped mug, watching the floodlights he'd left on cast their glow across the yard. The ranch looked secure, protected, but he knew better now. Security wasn't about lights or locks. It was about mindset, about refusing to hand over your peace of mind to anyone who came knocking with a badge that didn't hold up. Janine called again that evening, her voice steadier than before. "I just wanted to say, you gave people something to think about, Roland. You made us realize we can't be so trusting anymore. We've all gotten too comfortable." Roland nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Comfort's fine, Janine. But comfort without caution? That's when people get hurt." She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You changed how I see things. Thank you for that." After hanging up, Roland leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle. He hadn't set out to change anyone's perspective. He had only done what he always did: assess, prepare, act. But now his actions had rippled outward. Neighbors who once waved casually at the end of their driveways were now checking twice before opening the door. Retirees who once believed scams only happened in big cities were now asking for credentials and calling the sheriff before letting anyone in. The imposters hadn't just tested Roland, they'd tested Palo Mesa, and though the community was rattled, it was stronger now than before. Roland thought about the younger families who had sat in the community hall, holding their children close as the sheriff explained the danger. He thought about Janine, who admitted she once let a fake utility worker on her property without thinking. He thought about Clark Beringer, who'd spat his toothpick into the dirt, muttering that cowards always prey on trust. Trust. That was the word that echoed in Roland's mind. Trust was necessary. No community could survive without it. But blind trust was a weakness, one that predators recognized and exploited. The lesson was simple, but hard to swallow. Peace doesn't last if you don't guard it. He let out a long breath. The army had taught him that survival wasn't about being the toughest man in the room. It was about awareness, discipline, and refusing to hand control over to someone else. That was true in a convoy on Highway 1 in Afghanistan, and it was true on a ranch in Texas. The night deepened. Roland stood and walked the edge of his property, his boots pressing into the gravel with each steady step. He checked the barn, the gate, the fence line. Old habits, maybe, but not useless ones. As he walked, he thought of the impostors sitting in county lockup, waiting for their next move. They weren't the end of it. More would come. Maybe different faces, maybe different tactics. That didn't matter. What mattered was being ready. At the far edge of the driveway, Roland stopped and looked back at the house glowing under the floodlights. A house he had worked for, a house he had defended. And he thought of every person in town who now understood that peace wasn't free. It demanded vigilance. He spoke quietly to himself, words carried off by the night air. They underestimated me. That was their first mistake. The second was thinking this community wouldn't stand up. The lesson was carved clear now. You don't need to be a soldier to protect what's yours. You just need the courage to question, the discipline to prepare, and the will to act when the moment comes. Roland turned back toward the house, the night cool on his face. He wasn't naive enough to think the danger was gone, but he also wasn't weighed down by it. Instead, he carried something steadier, a reminder that even in chaos, control belongs to those who refuse to give it up. And that's the truth worth holding on to. Peace is not something handed to you. It's something you defend. If you found this story meaningful, take a moment to think about your own life. Who do you trust too easily? Where do you leave yourself vulnerable? Preparation doesn't mean paranoia. It means valuing your peace enough to guard it. And if stories like this one made you think, don't forget to subscribe. There are more lessons, more truths, and more stories worth sharing.